What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you 5 great games to play this October. Now, while it's easy to dive into things like horror games, etc., I fully admit that that's not really my favorite genre, so here I figured I would cover some RPGs that I think fit the season very well. And while the things that I'm talking about for these games will be mostly spoiler-free, you might want to watch out for some footage on screen, depending on what you classify as a spoiler, might be some stuff there. But for the most part, should be pretty light on anything like that. But with no further ado, let's actually jump into this list. First up, we have the mandatory one, Vampyr the Masquerade Bloodlines. I don't think you can make a list like this without including this title, so naturally it's the best place to begin. On the off chance anyone is unfamiliar with Vampyr the Masquerade Bloodlines, however, it is based off of the TTRPG setting known as the World of Darkness, which is comprised of a collection of TTRPGs that includes Vampyr the Masquerade. And if you've watched the channel for a long time, you might be aware that I'm a big fan of the World of Darkness. And Bloodlines, despite being a very old game, is kind of their crown jewel of video games that they've made for that setting. Maybe we'll see Bloodlines 2 one day, but I don't think anybody's holding their breath for that at this point. But the reason you would of course want to play Bloodlines for Halloween is the vampire theme. Now, this is not just a vampire game really, but it is a full-on vampire RPG. We get to pick from multiple clans of vampires who all have their strengths and weaknesses, all while navigating hub areas, completing all sorts of ghoulish side quests, and getting deeply involved in vampire politics. And it's an amazing game full of choice and consequence that is nonetheless still a bit on the shorter side. A full playthrough might take you in the ballpark of 20 to 30 hours, so it's a pretty reasonable playtime that I would absolutely recommend anybody play for this season, because beyond just this season, it is an incredible game. Though that said, you will need the unofficial patch more than likely to play it well, as this game had a pretty notoriously poor launch, and then after it was fixed by fans via the unofficial patch, it kind of saw a second life and has since turned into a bit of a cult classic and done a significant amount of sales. Well over 1 million copies, I believe. Nonetheless, that brings us to our second title on the list, and keeping with our vampire theme, if Vampyr the Masquerade Bloodlines is a little too old for you, then I would recommend Vampyr. This is another vampire RPG, but rather than making a character, we play as a set character, Dr. Jonathan Reed, who returns to London during the Spanish flu before being quite promptly turned into a vampire who is investigating a blood plague that has stricken the districts of London that you, as a doctor and now a vampire, are in a very unique position to solve, which is a really cool premise. And overall, the game does a lot of things right. It is a little conversation heavy. You're going to be talking to a lot of the residents, learning about them, which will give you clues about their personality, etc., which can make them worth more experience if you decide to then feed on them. And the entire game has a sort of mechanic that scales the world around you difficulty-wise based on whether or not you choose to feed. And overall, it's a really solid experience. I would say the combat is a little bit janky. It's not so bad once you get the hang of it, and there are a few different playstyles available. But the combat, while I wouldn't say it's bad, it's definitely the weakest part of this game. But nonetheless, a great game to play in the month of October. Which brings us to our number 3 spot, and this is switching it up a little bit with Cult of the Lamb. This is an indie title that launched earlier this year where we play as the lamb. However, we start an actual cult. We take this adorable looking lamb and start a proper demon worshipping cult. Your job is to, of course, spread the good word of your cult, take care of your cultists, grow in power, and participate in these sort of roguelike dungeons as you seek to put down the masters of other cults to thus release your master from his bondage. And overall, it's kind of a cutesy game with a ridiculous theme that I think they absolutely nailed. This is a game I actually play pretty regularly, like maybe 30 minutes here and there kind of thing, because it is especially good on the Steam Deck actually. And if you're looking for something you can play in short bursts when you've got some time that also fits into the season, I think you would be hard pressed to look anywhere else besides Cult of the Lamb. Kind of a perfect choice, really. And that brings us to our number 4 spot. From here, let's move it a little bit into the horror genre, but also still an RPG, and that is Call of Cthulhu. This is, of course, based off the Cthulhu mythos, where we play as basically an alcoholic detective investigating a case of mysterious deaths on an island with a lot of mysterious goings-on, which, of course, quickly, as the title would probably tell you, devolves into Cthulhu cosmic horror nonsense. Call of Cthulhu is relatively short. You can beat the whole thing in probably 7-8 hours if you're running through pretty fast. And in classic Cthulhu fashion, we have to investigate this crime while also trying to maintain our own sanity. There are multiple endings to this one based on some of your choices in-game, all of course layered on top of the shambling eldritch horrors you will no doubt be trying to avoid. Overall though, pretty cool game. I think it drops the ball in some of the RPG aspects in the last half if I'm being super critical, but it's definitely the type of game that you should give a shot this October if you're looking for something to play, as it's got a pretty cool narrative and it's easy to knock out relatively quickly. So it's not going to eat up too much of your time. But that of course brings us to our last spot, and this is none other than Prey. Prey is a really fantastic game. It is, of course, an immersive sim from Arcane Studios, where we take on the alien entities known as the Typhon aboard a spaceship, where we are one of very few survivors. Now, this being an immersive sim, you are largely free to play the game however you wish. There's a ton of variations to the combat, your approach to things. The story itself is honestly pretty good. I enjoyed it a lot. However, what I think this game nails particularly well for the sake of this list is actually just the very creepy vibe to everything. The Typhon themselves, while kind of a generic blobby mess, nonetheless are pretty good at jump scaring you every once in a while. And they look super creepy. But what I would say actually puts this game on this list more so than this are the parts where you're actually out walking in space, because that, combined with the situation in the space station, I think really speaks to the sort of hopelessness of the situation of that game, which is just a small example of how Prey really nails home the vibe, if you will, of it being very creepy and hostile while simultaneously not necessarily being active. For instance, in a lot of scenes, there isn't necessarily anything moving or immediately jumping at you. You're not always fighting everything, but even when there's a moment of relative calm in the environment, the entire place still manages to feel just strangely out to get you, which I think is a really cool thing about Prey. But beyond that, it's also just an amazing game that I think people should try out, and hence it's on this list. But there you guys go, 5 games that I think are quite well suited to the month of October just ahead of Halloween, and I certainly hope they get you in the spirit. All of that said, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.